bridging the gap between economy and art, not the art market, art and economy, is something that is worth trying. And by experimenting to break these boundaries, I think we make something important. Again, thank you for being here. Thank you, David, for the tremendous work that you did, and also Noel. Thank you.
Hi, yes, I'm David. Good, thank you all for coming. Pocoyo made a good point. This is not about the art market. It's really about economic theory introduced to an art audience, which we believe is a first. The underpinning of much of this conference is a Keynesian quote that every economist is so familiar with, they'll be bored by, but here it is. Practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influences are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority, sorry, a little echo here. Madmen in authority, who hear voices in the air, are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. So the basic idea is a lot of economic wisdom is received. And so the point here, rather than bringing in interpreters of economics who have received wisdom from a few years back, to bring in actual academic economists or policy economists who are doing research today, so we're not at one remove. So I would compare today's event to smoking an unfiltered cigarette. There's no filter. Now, the part of this, as Pocoyo said, the point is this is part of the principle of the biennial, which is Biennale, which is to bring together people from different backgrounds. Something else above and beyond the Biennale that's happened is the IMF World Bank meetings are occurring as we talk. So much like you hear my echo, you can't see it, but there's this ominous, or let's say important economic conversation going on in Washington. But at the same time, it's a vague conversation because Christine Lagarde recently announced that the key to the future of the world economy is there are going to be multiple transitions, which to me is an insanely vague quote. But nonetheless, the FT said multiple transition. This quote, this phrase is as memorable as it's meaningful. So I'm not sure that the phrase is either memorable or meaningful, but that is where mainstream economics is, claiming that there are going to be multiple transitions, whatever they are. So that's where the IMF's position is. Our economists today each have their own position, but I think there's a shared consensus, a shared narrative in economics, which we'll convey today about the crisis. And a lot of that shared narrative among many different economists is there's a certain commonality among many of the crisis countries, that there is a boom followed by a bust. The boom manifested itself in different ways in each country, insofar as there was more of a real estate boom in Spain and Ireland, whereas here there was more of a boom in government services. Another aspect of the boom was that the economy was misdirected in some ways into non-productive sectors. That was the boom, then there was the bust. Economics, I think, has a good handle on all that. Now what is, to me, less of a clear question, even from academic economics. But that's where I begin and end. I'm now going to turn over to true experts. And to tell you the format of today, it's not really a debate, because to me, some of these topics, why even have a debate? Let's just hear what people have to say. The format is each presenter will speak for approximately 20 minutes, maybe 25, and then handle a few questions and answers for the remaining time of a half-hour slot. Then, hopefully, they'll all join us at the end for a joint conversation about what next. So I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Paolo Manasse, Professor of Macroeconomics and International Policy at the University of Bologna. He's taught at many other universities on both sides of the ocean. He's obtained his PhD from the LSE. He has some consultancy work with the IMF. I could go down his long, long list of academic credentials, but one other thing that's not on this resume is that he actually is an accomplished jazz musician. So with that, Paolo, I'd like to welcome you to the format. To the floor.
Okay, where is the... is there the pointer somewhere so I can go on with the presentation? Okay, so is my presentation somewhere? Yeah, okay, I go there. Okay, hello everybody, and thanks a lot to the organizer for having me here. This is my topic today, so I will talk about this. What's wrong with Europe and how to fix it. I reckon it's a very ambitious title, but you know, this is a very nice place. We are in Athens, so why not? So let me tell you the outline of the talk. So what I will discuss, I will kind of rush through because it's pretty long. I tried before coming here to last more than 20 minutes. But so I'll talk about these points. First, I will make the point that the euro area, unlike the US, is not recovering from the crisis, and I will call this persistent. So we are very sluggish, and we are not coming out, not as well as the U.S. The second point that I will make is that the crisis has hit different countries in sharply different ways. So some countries were not hit at all. Some countries were badly hit, and you know who I'm talking about, and also Italy is one of these countries. Okay, so the question is why? The third point I will try to address is that, you know, economists, that's something that you probably know, when they speak about anything, they speak about demand and supply. They always speak, or they should always speak about demand and supply, so I will talk about some of demand shocks. So what happened, what caused the crisis, fiscal austerity, a credit crunch, sovereign default. This is what economists call demand shocks. But I also spend some time about the supply side. So how do markets work? How do prices are set? Are wage flexible or are they rigid? How does the labor market function? All these ingredients are going to tell us something about the reason why some countries are badly hit and some countries have not been hit by the crisis. Okay, and then I will try to say something about the institutions, and I will make the point that our institutions in Europe are really upside down. They are exactly the opposite of what, you know, any meaningful person would think they should be. So they are really upside down, and this has not helped the crisis. In fact, this has added to the crisis. And so we really need to think a lot when you design our institutions, and we make the point that our institutions in Europe, you know, have made things worse. And what should be done? Well, we should fix all these things, and it will take a lot. But if we don't, you know, that's maybe even more trouble ahead. So this is what I'm trying to say. Okay, let's go to the first point. So the Eurozone is not recovering. And the first things that you see it from is from this picture. We have the US and we have the Europe. The US is the blue line, and you see that, you know, the per capita income then it was around $40,000 at the beginning of 2000. Then it kind of smoothly goes up. And then you get the crisis 2008, 2009. So you have a drop in the line. This drop is about $3,500 per capita. So it's pretty, you know, quite some money. But then you see that, you know, in 2009, 2010, GDP goes up, you know, income goes up, and now it's above where it was before the crisis. Now, if you compare this with what's happened in Europe, that's the yellow line. You know, you have to look at the right y-axis. You know, you start off with an average income, you know, about 23,000 euro per year in Europe. You go on pretty smoothly. Then you have a drop, okay, again, 2008. This drop is smaller than the US. So the crisis hits Europe to start with less than America. The crisis starts in America and then is transmitted to Europe. So Europe suffers on average, but less. But the problem is, that since then, since 2009, the yellow line is flat. You know, we are still below where we were still below before 2007. Okay, so the point is Europe is not recovering. Another interesting thing that this graph is telling us is the following. Here you have two bands. You have the blue bands, and you have some sort of yellow dotted lines. I'll call it the yellow bands. Now, the blue bands is the difference between the richest and the poorest state in the US, okay? And you see it, you know, it goes since 60,000 is the richest state at the beginning of the period, and about 25-ish is the poorest. So basically you have a difference of 5 to 1. So the richest state in the US is 5 times richer in terms of the average income than the poorest state in the US. So you're comparing Washington, D.C. with Mississippi, right? Now, if you compare the richest and the poorest in Europe, you're comparing Luxembourg with Latvia, okay? And first you see that the difference is much larger. It's about 9 times. So Latvia is 9 times. And also what you see is that this difference has been growing. And one of the worrying things about the crisis is that the divergence between European countries has increased. Now, I will make this point with these funny graphs. Now, this is very familiar to economists, probably less to non-economists, but let me try to spend some time on these graphs. So the point of the graph is that since the crisis, the process of convergence between European countries has slowed down dramatically. This is the point of this graph. How do we see that? Now, here we have a graph, let's take the Eurozone, and on the x-axis I have the initial per capita income in a country. A little dot on this graph is a country. And on the y-axis, I have the cumulative growth in income from 2000 and 2007, that's the blue point, from 2007 to 2012, that's the red point. Now, the fact that this point tend to cluster around this a line which has negative slope, what that means is basically that the countries which were poorer at the beginning of the period grew faster than the countries which were richer at the beginning of the period who grew less fast, okay? Now, you see that if you look at the blue point, you have a very steep line. This means that Europe, the differences between European countries were becoming smaller in the sense that poorer countries were growing faster, but this process has almost come to a green, and you see it because the red points, are kind of scattered all over the place and are not, and the slope of the line, which is the speed of convergence, has halved. Okay, let's move on. Now, these things that the persistence of the crisis and the differences across country are really two faces of the same medal. Here we have a graph about unemployment rate. That's the other important and difficult thing. Now, again, we have a yellow line. The yellow line is the Eurozone, is the average unemployment rate in the Eurozone. The blue line is the unemployment rate in the US. Now, you start at the beginning of 2000, Europe had higher unemployment, it was about 9%, than the US, the US was below 5%, and then you see that in 2008, we have a sharp increase in the unemployment rate in the US, and which reaches the European level, but the difference, however, is that starting in 2010, the unemployment rate in the US, the blue line, is going back, is going down. While that does not happen in Europe, the European unemployment rate, the yellow line, keeps going on. So this is an issue of persistence, which is very worrying. And then there is an issue of the heterogeneity, so the difference between the countries. Now, the blue range is the difference between the highest state, the unemployment rate in the highest, which is the state with the highest, and with the lowest. And you see that more or less the differences are more or less constant. Then, there is a little bit of increase in the difference in 2008, but then you basically converge back. Now, look at the dotted lines in Europe. I mean, already at the beginning of 2000, we had huge differences in unemployment rates across country. We had Spain, we had unemployment rate close to 20%, and we had, I don't know, it's probably Luxembourg, which had, ridiculous unemployment rate. And look what happened in the crisis as of 2008. We're really diverging, and we have Spain going through the roof, okay, and other countries experiencing no unemployment. So we have a huge increase in the differences across European countries, while we don't have that in the US. Okay, now let me just put my hat of an economist and say a few things about demand and supply. So what is demand, what is supply? Why is that useful in understanding the facts I've been talking about? Okay, people tend to think that whenever a transaction takes place, you have to look at two sides of the market. One side is how much do you want to spend, I mean the demand side, and this is the downward sloping curve. Y is the quantity that you want to buy, P is the price. The idea is that you want to buy, a consumer wants to buy more when the price goes down. And so you have a negatively sloped demand curve. Now, you have to look at the other part, which is the supply curve. This is the production side. Producing goods is costly, and in order to cover the cost, you need a higher price. So you want to produce more, you need a higher price. This is the supply curve. Now, whenever a transaction occurs, demand and supply meet, and there is an exchange, and the quantity that is exchanged at the given price, and the price is represented by the point 1 in this figure, where the demand crosses the supply. Now, why am I telling you this? This is a simple but effective way to think about the crisis, because what the crisis is a shock to demand. You can think about fiscal tightening and the troika. You can think about the credit crunch and banks being failed and they cannot give money to households and firms. But basically, there is less money to spend. Therefore, the demand shifts to the left, and there is a reduction in demand. Now, what happens generally when there is a reduction in demand? Two things happen. The prices go down, and the output goes down. Now, whether it's prices or output which fall, okay, depends on the supply side. So, if you have a market in which you have a supply curve like ASR, which is very flat. This means that you have firms with a lot of market power, very little competitions. The firm faces a reduction in demand. It doesn't reduce the prices. It keeps the prices as high as before. If you have little competition, then you move from point 1 to point 3. Okay. If you have a lot of competition and market works, your aggregate supply curve is almost vertical, and when demand goes down, you move from point 1 to point 2. The story I'm trying to say is that if you want to understand why some countries were badly hit by the same type of shock, you have to look at the supply side. And if you have a competitive market, most of the adjustment falls on price and little on output and employment. If you have markets which are not competitive, most of the adjustment fall on output and prices do not adjust. So this is the point. I don't know, I hope this is clear, but if not, let me try to illustrate this. How much do I have in time? I have another 10 minutes. Fantastic. Okay. So if there are anything you want to ask, please ask now or shut up forever. No, just ask whenever you want. Okay. Anyway, so let me try to make some examples of this story I'm trying to make. The first example is, let's look at the unemployment rate. Now, this picture is making the following point. The country which have experienced the largest increase in unemployment with the crisis are the same countries where unemployment was already high before the crisis. Okay, that means that labor market did not work properly, that prices did not adjust, that had workers which had insider power, which were able to keep their wages despite the crisis. Okay, and that led to a lot of unemployment. So, in order to make this point, I've plotted here against all the points are the countries, and on the x-axis, I have the unemployment rate before the crisis. On the y-axis, on the vertical axis, I have the increase in unemployment during the crisis between 2008 and 2012. And what you see is that points tend to cluster around a positive sloped line, which means that on average, countries which have experienced the highest unemployment rate were also the country where unemployment was higher before the crisis. So this is telling us that the supply side of the economy is important. Now let's look at this other feature about the supply factor. Okay. Now the point of this picture is the following one. income in real terms falls more where productivity growth was lower before the crisis. Okay, if you look at incentive and how markets work, well, one way to look at things is to say, how fast did productivity grow in this country? How were the incentive to invest by firms? What this picture is telling us, okay, we have the growth of productivity between 2000 and 2008, so before the crisis, and then we have the cumulative growth of GDP, of real income per capita after the crisis. What this picture is telling you is that on average, the countries which have done best, so the countries which are higher on the graph, where growth was higher despite the crisis, are also the country where productivity was growing faster before the crisis. Okay. Now we have some exception, okay, and something interesting. I mean, we have a country like this one, okay. This country here is Greece, okay. Greece was a country that, despite having a little bit of productivity growth, okay, did very badly. I mean, output fall in these 3 years something close to 20%. Okay, and we have other strange countries, like, for example, this one. Okay, this is Slovakia. Okay, Slovakia did fantastically in terms of productivity. Okay, so it's huge 30% productivity growth, but still income fell by almost 5%. So why is that? The reason, well, the reason is that Greece is there were many other things going on, and typically things on the demand side, like, belt tightening and the troika. And so there was a huge shock in demand that explained this. And for Slovakia, well, it's a very small country, very export-oriented countries. He was very badly hit by the international recession, so exports fell a lot. So the point of, also one point of this graph is that there is something else than supply, and we have to go back to demand. And that's what I'm going to do now. Right, demand factors. Okay, I'll try to be quick, very quick, because I have a lot of things to cover. But okay, let's focus on the deficits and maybe say something about the debts. Okay, now here, again, the blue line is America, the yellow line is the Eurozone. However, there is an important difference between these two areas. One, the main difference is that when we talk about the budget in the US, we are talking about a federal budget with something which is big, and exists. When we talk about Europe, there is no federal budget. I mean, there is a Eurozone budget, but it's something like 1% of the area GDP, and it has to be balanced each year. So there is nothing like comparable. There is no federal budget like in the US. Okay. So what does this graph tells you? Well, this graph tells you a few things about the fact that Obama did much more an expansionary policy than European countries on average. You see that the blue line goes back much further. That means that the ratio of the budget deficits over GDP, was very much increased. So it was larger deficits on average in the US than in Europe. And also, a very interesting thing is the ranges. Okay, so if you look at the range, the blue range, that is the ratio of deficit to GDP at the state level, okay, in America. And you see that very little happens there. So this guy, Mississippi, Ohio, and so on, more or less they did what they were doing before, so there was no change in their policies. Now, if you compare that with the yellow dotted lines, I mean, this country is Ireland, okay? Ireland arrived to run something like a 30% deficit over GDP in 2010, and that was when Ireland bailed out the banks. So also an interesting thing that appears from this graph is as follows, that one crucial difference between the US and the Eurozone that you shouldn't forget is that in the US, it's the federal budget that takes care of macroeconomic stabilization. In Europe, there is nothing comparable. It's the country states that takes care of macroeconomic stabilization. And we see that when we compare the debt. Now, the debt, were not that dissimilar between the America, the blue line, starting below 60% in 2000. In Europe, the average of the Eurozone debt was slightly larger. And what you see here is that with the crisis from 2008, the federal debt in the US rises much more rapidly than in the US. That's a sign of, spend more, tax less, and finance yourself out of the recession by debt. And Europe did it to a much lower extent. But what is really crucial is the difference between the states, okay? Because states in the US have very little debt, almost no debt. The largest debt in terms of debt of a state, like California, is below 20% of GDP, okay? And it's pretty stable. That's exactly the point I wanted to make. So there is no macroeconomic stabilization at the level of the state in the US. That's exactly the opposite of what goes on in Europe. And look here, what is the divergence of debt between countries like, I think this is Latvia, that has basically zero debt, okay? And countries here like Greece that has a lot, okay? So the huge differences, and these are structural differences, which you have to take 3 minutes? Okay. Let me see. Okay, let me jump to this, okay? The fact that Europe does not have a budget implies a reasonable budget, okay? Implies another important point. So the point is that the degree of redistribution that occurs between European countries is tiny, is very, very small, okay? So here is the list, is this data from 2011. This is the percentage of GDP that each country is either contributing or is receiving from the EU budget. And from this, you see that the highest contributor, where is it? The highest contributor is, believe it or not, is Italy. So Italy contributes 0.38, so less than half of a percentage point of its GDP to the EU budget, okay? And the highest receiver is Hungary, which get about 4.6 of its own GDP from the EU. Okay, so these are the numbers, okay? Now, look at the US, okay? This is not strictly comparable because this is the amount that each country either gave to the federal budget or received, okay, in 10 years, okay? But, well, if you divide it by 10, you get more or less what they get or what they give per year. And here you see that the richest one, in 10 years, gave something like 206%, so twice their GDP in 10 years. So that means that they gave to the federal budget, they paid in more than what they got out, something like 20% of their GDP per year, okay? And 1 minute, okay? And see what happened to, what is the story about the poor countries like Puerto Rico, for example. Puerto Rico in 10 years got something like almost three times of its own GDP in 10 years, so about 30% per year. So the scale of the transfer that occurs between states in the US is at least one order of magnitude larger than the transfer that occur within Europe. Okay, so this is an important point. Let me rush to the end, okay, and try to summarize some of the things that emerged here, and then say what should we do. Well, what is the problem about our institutions? Well, they are to some extent, badly designed, and there is a political problem. We will talk about that later. But basically, number one, there is no budget for stabilizing the economy at the aggregate level when you have aggregate shocks, which means shocks that hit every country. Second, we had the only way to run macro stabilization is at the country level, but still we have a lot of constraints, like the Growth and Stability Pact, the fiscal compact. So we have only the fiscal instrument, but we have so many constraints that we cannot use it for stabilizing the economy. We have a very bad system in which there are no transfer and no insurance between states, but at the same time we are bailing out countries like Greece and Ireland and other countries. So we are saying we are not doing anything to prevent a crisis, but once there is a crisis, we are paying a lot of money in it. So that's exactly the wrong thing that you should do. You should say, okay, we have some transfer ex ante that, to prevent the crisis. If the crisis occurs, that's your problem. That's what we should do. That's what the US does. The US, the fiscal discipline is not enforced by the federal state, is enforced at the local state, but there are transfer, and there is a very precise no bailout commitment, so the federal state is not bailing out the states in the US. So exactly the opposite of how things are designed here. So what should be done? And I rush through, can I, or do they have to?
What can be done is you're allowed to ask 2 questions.
Okay, great.
Okay. They can be in Greek, and Noel will translate.
Okay.
So 2 questions.
Right.
So anyone have any questions? Any hands? If there are no questions, I have a question, which is if you could just talk for a few minutes about the special case of Italy.
Right.
How Italy is in the crisis.
Right. Okay, so where Italy fits in this picture, I try to give you, well, it fits in different ways. First, it fits because it's one of the countries which, before the crisis, did worse in terms of productivity. Okay, so it fits in the graph that I showed you before. So it's not surprising that Italy is among the countries which are doing worse today. Because it did very poorly before. So basically, if you have a country which does not grow and then it takes a hit, it's not going either after the crisis. And that's what happened in Italy. Okay? The second thing about Italy is clearly debt. Okay? Italy has a long history of very high debt, was second to Greece for, always, any time that I can remember, and therefore is very much exposed to financial markets expectations and financial market contagion and fears and so on. So whenever you have a run on debt and interest rate goes up by a little, then it becomes a huge issue because the amount of interest you're paying more can be devastating. So it's very fragile because of the history of accumulated debt. And then there is a long history, unfortunately, of political instability, which is now haven't been talking about, which adds to the uncertainty and to the kind of bad reputation that Italy has built over time in terms of the solvency of its debt and the credibility of its own, political class. So, I could talk much more about Italy, but I think that's where it fits the picture.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that.
Okay.
There's a
Thank you.
clarifying explanation. I'd like to emphasize our later speakers will be much more Greek-focused, so stick around and we'll get more Greek-focused. But our next speaker has a particular focus on Ireland. Professor Francis Wan has been the director of ESRI, the Economic and Social Research Institute in Ireland, since December 2006. Irish newspapers have called ESRI the heart of the Irish economic establishment. She has a graduate degree from Nuffield College, Oxford, has taught in both American and Irish universities, including Trinity, has been chair of numerous scientific boards as well as arts organizations. And part of her presentation today is interesting on several fronts, but one is one group in Ireland has done relatively well since the crisis. It may not be the group that you think, but some people in Ireland have come out just fine from the crisis. So with that, we'll get Frances ready. She'll be with us in a second. We will hear about Ireland. Stay tuned.
Να πούμε ότι τα κανάλια στις συσκευές διερμηνίας είναι τα αγγλικά στο 1 και τα ελληνικά στο 2. Can you be using it?
Is this loud enough?
No, we need this one.
Do you need that one too? Yep. Okay. Or that one? Okay, oh, so if I stand here, I do that. Okay, let me stand here for the moment. I feel a bit like a pop star when I hold one of these things, so I'll just maybe try to do without it for a second, and if I get up and around, I'll take it with me. I'm very delighted to be here this afternoon, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Ireland. And I guess the issue facing Ireland is not unlike the position facing Greece, and it goes back a little bit to the discussion that Paolo has just raised, which is that when you're an individual country faced with a crisis, it's what the extent to which you have control on things in your own country is actually quite limited. So let me basically talked about the fact that in Ireland we've really returned to quite what I call sober times. The Irish have a very good sense of humour, but there's a sense in which what's happened to us has actually been very sobering. And I make reference here to Seamus Heaney, our poet laureate, who died some weeks ago, and a lot of things came out about what he had said around the time of the crisis. And one of the points that he made was that he was asked, well, is poetry of any use in an economic crisis? And he said, well, if poetry and the arts can do anything, they can fortify your inner life and your inwardness. And I think it made a lot of people think about what was it that had happened in the economic crisis that had fed into other aspects of Irish life. And one of the things that has happened, and I think this kind of event is something of a similar resonance, is that the creativity across many domains has strengthened. And this is fed very largely into our theatre, it's fed into our film, it's fed into our television, and it's fed into the different kinds of events that are being held. And our next speaker, Heiner, has just recently returned from a festival which is called Kilconomics, which is basically where comedians and economists combine. It sounds like a dreaded combination, but it's one that's an interesting one in terms of something that would never have happened prior to the crisis. It's also obviously fed into a lot of new ideas, but there have also been, and I want to stress this now at the beginning, there have been some very, very high costs in Ireland arising from the crisis, and the ones that one would think about is mental health arising from unemployment, immigration, which is involuntary, where people don't want to go, they're highly qualified, but they don't want to leave, and they must, and in certain instances, very tragic cases of severe depression and on occasion suicide. So let me just talk about, I'm going to give you one slide on the Irish economy, everything you'd want to know about the Irish economy that you need to know for the rest of the talk. It's got a lot of, unlike Greece, it's got a very, very big multinational sector, and they're all in high growth areas. We have services that are really very important to us as an economy. We have a strong domestic food sector, which is getting ready to see a benefit from the removal of the Common Agricultural Policy. And we've got significant tourism. We don't have your wonderful weather, but we have our rain makes our country very green and very attractive. So they're all the positive sides. But just from where we are at the moment, we have high wage costs and high prices, strikingly to me much higher than the Greek prices that I've seen both this visit and last year when I was here. We still have some very strong vested interests in the country, and you know that expression, don't waste a crisis. One of the things that people are hoping very much is that some of those vested interests will actually be addressed in this context. We also have a public sector which is efficient, but not as efficient as it could be. And I always look at that as a boon. That's something you can do to make yourself better with actually having to get help from outside on it. And the Troika, who obviously you're friends with the Troika as we are, in Ireland the Troika has been very, very popular. In fact, they talk about the fact that when the IMF would go into restaurants, people would come over and shake their hands and say, very glad that you're here, I'm glad to see that things are getting sorted out. So there's been that somewhat different relationship in some countries to the Troika, but in an Irish context it's seen actually as getting us to help face up to the reality of a changed and a more sober world. So I'm going to just give you a few slides, and they'll be simpler than the slides we've just had because multi-country slides are much harder than single-country slides, so these diagrams are quite easy. So I'm going to touch a little bit just on growth, on unemployment, on migration, on the public finances, and on poverty and equality. And I suppose really at the centre of all that, as Greece has faced as well, is that the government response, in order to maintain political cohesion, in order to contain social cohesion, requires, if you're going to have austerity, and when you're in a bailout situation, you have to, if austerity is what's given you, you're not in a strong negotiation position, then you need to retain solidarity. So this is the first diagram. Let me walk over this just for a second to focus on it. This is Irish growth rates rates. Now, these are rates of growth between 1949 and 2012. And what you just see, one of the pictures you see, it goes up and down all over the place. Now, if government policy was working really well, you would have much less volatility than you'd have. One of the reasons we've had volatility is because policy hasn't actually done the right thing. So what you can see here is when we went into the euro, this sudden explosion in the growth rate up above 10% in certain years. That was an unsustainable growth rate, the result of having the euro, the monetary policy in the euro, not suiting Ireland, and instead of fiscal policy, which the government controlled, counteracting the monetary policy of the euro, it actually reinforced it. So this unsustainable growth period is up here, and then you can see, and you remember that picture, the last diagram, this is the drop that Ireland suffered in 2008-2009, which was absolutely massive and extremely sudden. So just to let you show that we had volatile growth rates before, but even our worst recessions previously, which were ones in the 50s and ones in the 80s, they were nothing on a par with this. This was just completely unprecedented. Just to put it briefly in context, and you can see what happens when you start putting in other countries. It gets very pretty in colours, but very complex. But all you want to look at here is Ireland is the green one, and you can see our fall deeper at that point than anybody else's. And the purple one is Greece. So Greece didn't fall at the same time frame. It was a different time frame to Ireland, and essentially, at this stage, has greater negative growth than Ireland has. We're now back just above the line. What happened to employment and unemployment? And that's really the most, for a society, that's really the most severe social effect where it begins to impact. So we had in the period from 2000 up to 2008, we had steadily growing employment rates. In fact, we had a lot of in-migration. A lot of people from Eastern Europe came in. A lot of people came to Ireland in order to learn English, to improve their English. So we had a lot, in fact, of migration in. And the unemployment rate was down here, just at around 4%, which again, historically, is much lower than we'd have had. We'd have had growth rates of about 7%. So this was much, much lower than that. So you can see the immediate impact. The unemployment rate goes up from under 4 to almost 15% in a very, very short period. And you see the employment rate falling down from over 68% down to under 60%. Very significant change in a really, really short period. And that's a fair characteristic of just the extent of that change, much, much bigger changes than previously. This is a diagram which is a bit messy, but I think it's an important one for Ireland and for people who know anything about Ireland. So it's running from 1987 up to 2012. And what the blue line is net migration. It's the net change in population from people moving in and people moving out. So what you can see is it was negative here. That meant that we had more immigrants than emigrants. Then from the 1996-97 onwards, we had more immigrants than emigrants. So this was where we're way above, we've up to, let's say, this year, which would have been 2007, we had net immigration. Our population was growing through migration by over 100,000, which for a population of 4.5 million is a very significant amount of net immigration. And then, as I say, with the collapse, we now have net emigration. So once you're below this horizontal line, you've got more people going out than going in. But the point I really want to say to you, and I think this from a societal point of view really matters, is the green and the rust color. So the green is telling you what is immigration. So the numbers actually coming in. So the blue line has kind of netted them out, has taken one from the other. But the green one shows you that down here we had a certain amount of immigration in the 80s and early 90s. A lot of that was Irish people who'd left, being away for 5 or 10 years, coming back to Ireland. Small number of other Europeans coming in within the smaller EU as it was at the time. But it was really quite small. It was under 25, 30,000, that kind of range. Then we had a huge step up with the opening up of the Eastern European borders and with a shortage of labour domestically. You can see that in 2007, again, the peak year, we had 150,000 people coming into the country, which, as I say, for 4.5 million population is just an extraordinarily large number. But you'll see all the time, even when we had immigration, we also had emigration. So there's a constant flow, because when you're in a small country, people leave. Young people graduate, they want to go off and do something different. They go off and then they come back at a later stage. But what we have at the moment then is net emigration, but actually we still have over 50,000 people coming into Ireland every year. And we have about 85 to 90,000 leaving. So that leaves for quite a dynamic culture. It means actually that the cultural mix is changing all the time. Okay, point that differs from what Paula said in the previous talk is that we, in fact, had a declining debt to GDP ratio from 1995 onwards. This pretty picture is the best news a government can see. It says the amount of debt relative to the amount of gross domestic product we have, the amount we're producing, is falling steadily. But of course, it was falling because we had unsustainable growth rates. So what happened was that when the crisis hit in 2008, nobody worried too much at the beginning because they felt our debt to GDP ratio was low enough to carry us through whatever would happen. But in fact, you can see what happened was it came down slowly, but it absolutely zoomed up until in 2012, it's at just under 120% of GDP. So we went from being a very healthy economy to a very unhealthy economy very quickly. These are just indicators of poverty, and I'm not going to dwell on them for any length, other than to show you that since the recession started, it is the case most of these are going back up again, which means you're talking about a deterioration in income distribution within the country. But let me go to the next one because it's about what happened to different groups. And I think this is quite instructive in terms of the politics, maybe of different from Greece as to what happened in Ireland. So the first diagram up here at the top, this shows you what we call the income distribution effects of the first austerity budget were. So when the government went into realizing that we had a major crisis, they immediately introduced a budget, and that budget hit heaviest on the wealthiest people in the country. So when you have the steep at this end, what you're saying is the wealthiest people took the biggest hit, and it went right down to the lower groups. This is a kind of a group I'll come back to in a moment. But for the most part, it was what we call improving in income distribution. And that was done to enhance solidarity. We've a crisis, folks. If we're going to have a crisis, we're going to have the people who can best afford to contribute. But since the crisis, in subsequent budgets, we've had less and less hit on the wealthier people. There's actually been a redistribution away from wealthier people. So if you take the cumulative budgets, all the budgets together, what we have is a much more, I mean, there's still, the top groups are still being hit more as a result of budgets than the people at the bottom, but it's much less steep than it was at this point. And I think that it was this point here that kept the solidarity at the beginning, and it was this later issue here, as this has happened, that we've had issues of much more concern with solidarity. Now, within that group, there's one particular set of people who were affected somewhat differently to others. So what you want to see with this pattern here is this deep red sort of musty line is telling you what the distribution effect was on all families, okay? So it's going down here, and that's as you get to the top group, they're bearing more. But that's showing the average for the whole country. Now there's two groups I'm taking out here just to show you a point about solidarity and distribution. And one is households with kids, household with at least one child. And what you'll see is that their line lies everywhere below the average for the country. So in fact, families with children have borne above average reduction in their incomes as a consequence of the crisis. This particular group have actually way above the average, and what you're talking about is these are households with an elderly person. And what you can see is that some of them, there's even a positive. So who are they? This was the families with an older person in it. How did that happen? How did they actually end up in some cases being better off? Well, what happened was when the crisis broke and there was a government budget coming up and there was an announcement that older people were going to be hit with the removal of some of the government medical cards that they had, reduction in the services they were going to get, they did something which you saw a lot of here, but we didn't see a lot of in Ireland. They went out onto the streets. And you'll notice this is basically the grey protest in September 2008. Now you'll notice the women aren't as grey as the men for some reason. Seems to be a pattern in every country. But the men and women came out. It was a beautiful day. The government got absolutely terrified. And as a consequence of that, up until the coming budget where they're expected to be hit again, the older people have done relatively better. Okay, so what about the future for Ireland? Basically, stability in the EU is absolutely crucial, and the sort of issues about Europe getting its act together, getting sorted out, is massively important.
Our growth depends on exports, and our main export markets are the US and the EU. Can we recover? The extent to which we'll recover is going to depend on our exports. And confidence domestically also matters, because consumer expenditure is very badly hit when there's no confidence. But there is this very strong feeling in Ireland, as I'm sure there is in Greece and in many of the countries, that uncertainty has gone on and on in Europe in a way that seems to be making the extent of this crisis much longer than could be reasonably realized. So just to put you to where the future is, and this affects Greece as well as it does Ireland, but this is just showing average growth rates for GDP, global growth rates. So this is for the world. And we're about here now, about just coming out of this tip here, we're on the way up here. And this is the National Institute for Economic and Social Research in London. These are their projections for world growth up to 2020. So what you can see here is an expectation that world growth is going to rise. So from the point of view of countries who are in recession and trying to get out of that, that's a very good thing. But the question is, how is it doing for the different markets that we're in? And the difficult news for Ireland and for Greece, and certainly for Ireland in the context of the US, is that the US growth rate this one is in slightly the wrong place, this should be down here on the red one. The US growth rate is lower than the average, and the EU growth rate is lower than the average. So our big markets are not the ones that are growing fast. On the other hand, if you take China, it's way above the global average. So a big issue for us in Europe, a big issue for recovery, is getting outside of our local markets in order to get recovery with higher growth rates. In Ireland, we've looked at a number of scenarios, a recovery scenario where the EU finally does get things sorted out, and our national macro strategies work, a delayed one where the EU does it, but we mess up ourselves. And one of the things we have to realize is that countries can mess up in terms of their own policies. And then there's a stagnation scenario where Europe just stagnates. And the problem is, if Europe just stagnates for countries like Greece and for Ireland, there isn't much that we can actually affect on that, because we're small relative to the EU average. So in the Irish context, if we do get a proper recovery, we will get rapid growth in our GNP. If we get stagnation, we're going to end up down here on the black line, and the middle line is where we don't handle our policies domestically very well. In the case of our debt to GNP ratio, as opposed to GDP ratio, you can see it's up here at the moment. If we basically get the growth the recovery within Europe, that will rapidly fall down, and by 2020 be close to 100%, which we consider to be pretty stable. If it doesn't, if we end up with a stagnation strategy within Europe, we'll end up hovering above 120% of debt to GNP, which is not really considered sustainable. And our unemployment rate, if we don't get growth in Europe, is going to stay up here at 12%. So what happens in Europe matters to the countries of Europe particularly, and that issue which was discussed about US policy versus EU policy really comes to the fore. So a debate in Ireland that's ongoing at the moment, we're having our budget next week, is that the Troika said that it wanted us to cut the deficit by a further 3.1 billion. And the reduction so far, the way in which we've met our delivery has actually done very well for us in terms of the markets. Our cost of borrowing has now gone way, way down. But what happened last week was there was an agreement between the government and the Troika to go for a settlement of 2.5 billion. So that's the first light we've seen of a reduction in the demand for a reduced deficit compared with what was previously. And I think a lot of that came out of the solidarity focus. So this is just another picture of, which again was one of the marches in 2012, which was the first year the trade unions really went out and marching. And as you can see, it's a very orderly march, and it didn't have any enormous impact on anybody. I think there was a general feeling of happiness in the government that it was out there to let the Troika see that although Irish people were in general had adopted to the changes, they were capable of going out out onto the streets. Again, you'll notice it was a good day for the weather, which is always very important for marches in Ireland. Yeah, final thing is the austerity has been painful. The social response has been relatively muted. As I say, very, very few street disturbances in relation to it. Distribution effects, I think, have helped that, and the delivery on promises have been rewarded by the markets, which I think has helped. But there's a lot of legacy issues to be handled, because we've made some short-term policies to try to get the finances back in order, and they're going to create legacy problems, and there's some old legacy issues to be sorted. So I'll stop there. Okay.
Thank you very much for that parallel. If there, because we're running late, if there are no questions, we'll move on. But are there any questions before we move on? Okay, we'll move on. There are questions later. Our next speaker is going to give you a very radically different perspective. It's going to disagree with our first two speakers. He's a distinguished German-based economist, Heiner Flassbach. He's connected to the United Nations, and in Germany he was chief macroeconomist in the German Institute for Economic Research. So for a heterodox, very different perspective, we're about to hear from Heiner. So get ready.
Yeah, hi. No, do I need it? Yeah? Okay. So yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm asking some very simple, maybe simple-minded questions that you haven't yet heard the answers of, namely, who's to blame? Who got it wrong? Who got it right? Is it just a question of having a monetary union and some countries going this way, the other countries going that way, and economists cannot say why? What went wrong? Why was the monetary union, why does it go astray? Why is it in danger of being, well, breaking apart at a certain point of time? So we have to ask the question, so what is wrong in this monetary union? Was it Greece? Was it Germany? Who was it? Who did it? Yeah, who did it? That's the question we have to answer, and I give you an answer. And you will see Greece is part of the answer, but Greece is not the most important part of the answer. It's the least important part of the answer. So, what happened in a monetary union? Well, to answer that question, we first have to ask, what is a monetary union? The hell, what is it? Why do we have monetary union? Why doesn't Greece no longer have the drachma and Germany doesn't have the D-mark? Why did we unite our currencies? Well, and there's one very simple answer. There's one very simple answer. Because at a certain point of time, these countries said, well, we want to have all rather low inflation like Germany. Germany always had an inflation rate of something like 2% in the past. And so now, at a certain point, the convergence was there. The inflation rate in other countries came down. And then at a certain point, they said, oh, why should we leave the currencies to the market? You know, there are vagaries in the market. The markets are moving wildly up and down. So why should we leave it to the market? We just join in our currencies, and we do exactly the same inflation rate now from now on forever. Very simple like that. And then you only have to ask a simple question, so did they do that? Were the inflation rate in all countries all the time the same? And if yes, then we have a difficult question, namely, why do we have such a big problem in the currency union? But if not, if the inflation rate is all the time the same in all these countries, so then we have a big problem, obviously, because that was against the target and against the whole idea of a monetary union. And so we're asking ourselves a very simple question, and I'm looking for my thing. Here it comes. We're asking ourselves a very simple question. So if something is wrong with the inflation target, and maybe Greece has too high inflation and Germany has too low, or other countries have too low inflation, then we have to ask a simple question, so where does the inflation rate come from? Where does the inflation rate come from? Does it fall from heaven or what? No, inflation has a simple determinant. Inflation comes from wages and nothing else, not from money. Not from money. That's an old theory in economics, but it's wrong. Inflation comes from wages, and exactly from what is called unit labor cost. That is how much a nominal wage increase is higher than the national productivity. So if you have 5% nominal wage increase, you have 2% productivity increase, then you have an increase of unit labor cost of 3%. Very simple. So this is a long chart. You see it's a very close relationship over many years from 1971, 61 even. The unit labor costs in each country determine the inflation rate. This is for the EU as a whole, but it's true for all the countries. So now we only have to ask the question, so what happened to these unit labor costs? I jumped this. And you see, it's a very simple answer. If you put 1999, which was the beginning of the currency union, as 100, and you accumulate all the unit labor cost increases, so the 2% or 3% every year, you find something very simple. Namely, that there are some countries, this is the inflation target that, oh, we had an inflation target in Europe. The inflation target was 2%, roughly 2%, 1.9. The ECB said, European Central Bank said, should be 1.9%. So if you have 1.9% inflation target, and you start in 99 and you go to 2012, you end up with something like 127. So the price level in all countries should be 127, and the unit labor cost level should also be 127 if we all agree on the same inflation target. That was the idea. And now you see there is a slight divergence over the years. You see there's one country that did exactly what was asked for. That's the orange line. That country is called France. And then there are other countries that have overshot. Here they have too high unit labor costs. These are called in this chart Southern Europe. Southern Europe. And Greece is one part of them. Greece is a bit higher than the green line, but not too much. So in Greece, every year, the unit labor costs increased by something like 2.6 or 2.7% every year, which is not much of an overshooting, but it's something. But there's one country that nobody has mentioned up to now. That country is called Germany. And you see what happened in Germany. In Germany, the unit labor costs increased by 0.7%. The 1.9 was a target. In Germany, unit labor costs increased by 0.7. You see, there's a slight problem. There's a slight problem. Because you can read the chart, you can say, so a product, an average product that was produced in 1999 at 100 euros, that the production cost would be 100 euros, is now produced in Greece at a level of 130 something euros. And in Italy also, and in Portugal, and in France, even in France, it produced by a level of 128. But in Germany, the same product is produced, and the cost level is only 110. So you have a problem, huh? If one country produces very, very cheap, and the other countries produce at a high cost level inside the currency union, you have a problem. Yeah, you have a gap in competitiveness of something like 20%. So each product in Germany is 20% cheaper than the comparable product in France or in Italy or in Portugal, in Spain or in Greece. So what are the people doing if the products in Germany are cheap? Well, very simple, they're buying German products. Huh? And even the Greece people are not buying Greece products, but they start buying more German products than ever before. Look around your cars here in Athens and elsewhere. Look around France. 10 years ago, there were hardly any German cars on France Street. Now, they're full of German cars. Yeah, it's very simple, because nobody told you shouldn't buy a German car. Because the German car has high quality and was cheap. So many people bought German cars. Wonderful, very good idea. Unfortunately, you couldn't afford them. That's the only problem. You bought the cars, but you couldn't afford them, because you had to lend money to buy them. You could not sell anything of your products or the same amount of your products to Germany to buy the German cars. But what you did, many people went to the bank, asked for a credit, and bought a German car. So what is the result? The result is very simple. Germany has has exported a lot of capital to Greece and to the other countries, all these countries there. And Germany is now the creditor, and all these countries are the debtor. You can see that. It shows up in what the economists call the trade balance. In the trade balance, you see the break with the currency union. Germany had a rather balanced current account, so exports minus imports, more or less, at the beginning of the currency union. And then Germany's surplus exploded into surplus, and the others went into deficit. And the simple reason for that is what we have seen, that there is a huge gap in competitiveness. That should not have happened, because it was against the idea of the monetary union. And the funny thing is that everybody converged to the German inflation target of 2%. But when all the others were there, Germany was below that. So when you had reached 2% from coming from above, you converged towards the 2% of Germany. Germany was already at 1%. That's a slight problem. You may ask me why Germany did that. Well, I can tell you I was part at the beginning of the government who did that. I was part of the government, and after I left, I have to say, after I left, fortunately, the thing was very simple. Germany had no idea how to revive its economy. There was no clue, they had no clue what to do. And so the only thing that came to their mind was a neoclassical recipe. They said, let's cut wages, let's moderate wages. They didn't say cut wages, but make the labor market more flexible, let's cut wages. And you see, the result is wonderful. The result is that Germany has a huge current account surplus, is the creditor country, and you are the debtor. You're the bad guy, and Germany is the good guy. Very simple. But if you look at the chart, you know who's to blame. Who's to blame for the problem? Who was wrong? Was Greece more wrong than Germany? No. Germany was more wrong than Greece, because it was the inflation target. If you measure against the inflation target, and if you take into account that inflation is determined by unit labor cost, it's absolutely logical. It's only two steps in logic from the determination of inflation to the question who was wrong and who was right. But you're told all the time that you are wrong. Greece got it wrong, Germany got it right. Why do you believe that? Yeah, why do you believe that? That's a crucial question. So what you believe also is now that you should do the same thing that Germany did. Everybody believes, or in Greece, 98% of all the people believe that Germany got it right, Greece got it wrong. So you just have to copy what Germany did, and then everything's fine. Again, it's totally wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. It's nonsense. It's plain nonsense. You see what you did? Greece is the best adjuster. So we have adjustment programs dictated by the Troika, the IMF, come and tell you what to do. So the first thing that you have to do is you have to cut wages. You see? Greece cut wages. The Greece curve is going down. The Greek curve is going down. So Greece is the best wage cutter under the sun. Greece has cut wages by something like 20%. But unfortunately, if you look at the chart, it wasn't enough. You have not yet reached the German line. You should go down there to the blue line at least. In reality, you should go below the blue line to regain market shares that you have lost against Germany in the past 12 years. So Greece has to adjust further, not only the 20% of wage cut that you got up to now, but you have to have another 20% and then maybe another 20% to become really competitive. That's what they have in mind. That's what they really have in mind. Madame Merkel has exactly that in mind, and she praises Greece everywhere for being a successful adjuster, the best adjuster in Europe. Unfortunately, there's a little problem with that, and you know it better than I do. What happens if you cut wages? On the one hand, you improve your competitiveness. That's right. You have now, the cost level of Greece is down to 122. It's still not at Germany's level, so no gain against Germany, but a gain against the other southern European countries, a little gain. But unfortunately, if you cut wages of the people in a country, what are people doing? What did you do when your wages were cut by 20%? Well, you cut your expenditure. You cut your domestic demand. Everybody cuts by 20% at least, because you have to survive. So if you cut your wages by 20%, that is what Professor Manas unfortunately forgot, because he's a neoclassical economist, to say is that if you cut by 20%, your domestic demand collapses by 20%. If your domestic demand collapses by 20%, your unemployment goes up. You have cut your wages and unemployment went up. That's funny, because this is against the market, because if the market works right, Professor Manas explained that, then you cut wages, then unemployment goes down, because the price is lower for labor, so people ask more, demand more labor, and then everything is fine. Unfortunately, it didn't work. Something was wrong here. Yeah, and this is the crucial question you have to answer yourself. Everyone has to answer in Greece. Was this the right way to do it or not? My answer is very clear. No, it was a stupid way to do it. It was an absolutely stupid way. Given that, what happened there, it was an absolutely stupid way to do what you did. But I don't blame you. I blame those who asked you to do that. Those have to be blamed. Those that said that Germany has gotten everything wrong and Greece got everything right. And what happens now, if everybody now, well, the next step, I think I have a little time left. The next step is very simple. The next step is to ask the other countries that have not yet adjusted to do the same that Greece and Spain have done already. You see, Greece and Spain have adjusted a bit, but I said it's not enough. Germany is going to stay there, I tell you. The wage increases in Germany are very low, still very low. So Germany is going to stay there somewhere. So you have to adjust downwards. And as I said, if you want to really gain market shares, you have to go below Germany. Because to be at par with Germany at the same price level is not sufficient, unfortunately. You have to go below. So you cut another 20% or 40%, but then your domestic demand is dead. Huh? Then your unemployment is not 25%, but 40% or 45%. That's the choice that you have. But you see, the funny thing here in this chart is, that two countries have not yet adjusted at all. Two countries have not yet adjusted at all. And these countries are Italy and France. So Italy and France should do the same. You see, the gap between Italy and France and Germany in terms of competitiveness is widening. So that means these countries are still losing every day market shares against their German competitors. So what happens if they would do the same as Spain and Greece would do? Well, it's very simple. Their domestic demand would also collapse. Their domestic demand would also collapse, and they would get 25% unemployment or something like that. Then is the only question we have to answer, whether Europe or these countries would politically survive that as democracies. That's the only simple answer we have to, the only question we have to answer. Would democracy survive 25% all over Europe, which is the level we had in the Great Depression in the 1930s? Now we're at 12% in Europe. But if France and Italy do exactly the same what Spain and Greece did, then the disaster would grow. But that is exactly what Germany is asking for. That is exactly what Germany is asking for. And it would mean in addition that we would have deflation all over Europe. It starts already. We are going into deflation. Deflation means falling prices. That's exactly the opposite of what we wanted in the currency union. Namely, we wanted to have a moderate inflation rate, but a positive inflation rate for many reasons I don't want to explain here. It was 2%, but now we're going into deflation. Is that what you want? Because we have an experience with deflation. Look at Japan. Japan is now for 20 years in deflation and 20 years in quasi-recession or in stagnation. So what the Germans say is, we all go into deflation. Nobody's saying that, but implicitly they're saying it. And France and Italy repeat the exercise that we have done in Spain and Greece. I can only hope that some people wake up. At a certain point, some people have to wake up, you see, before the disaster is here. We are already in a disaster, but the disaster can be bigger. There is no limit to the level of disaster that is possible in Europe. And if we do not understand very quickly what is going to happen, then the disaster will definitely be there. So the answer, what is the answer, the reasonable answer, what can be done? Well, there's only one way out. I'll show you the way out. This is all disaster. But there's only one way out. The way out is, if the euro should survive, the German wages have to rise. Germany engineered enormous pressure on the wages in the beginning of the 2000s that the wages would not increase, political pressure on wages, on wage negotiation, enormous political pressure. So why don't they do the opposite now? They can encourage wage increases. There's not a market. The market is not working anyway. So why don't they encourage wage increases so that, you see here in the scenario up to 2022, without further wage cuts, and without deflation in Europe, you have at least the competitiveness at par, which is not sufficient, but it is at least a level where you can start thinking again about economic revival and economic recovery. You see, it's very simple. You need three logical steps. You need the determination of inflation by unit labor costs. You have to look at what happened to wages, and you have to use causal therapy in the end. Everything has to be done by, in the end, by causal therapy, you remove the causes of the divergence, you remove the causes of the crisis, and then you get back to something normal. But this is very far away. I have to tell you, this is very far away, so that I do not say this is a realistic scenario. But if we don't start fighting for that kind of scenario right now, and the southern European countries, including France, begin to understand what is happening, then the disaster will be with us. Thank you.